Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Thanks, and glad to be here.
The United States has a new national security strategy. What does the world look like under a second Trump administration? Should the U.S. no longer strive to be a superpower? We take a look at what in the document seems to strengthen U.S. security, as well as what elements might undermine it and alarm us the most. Next up, we discuss whether progress has been made on the Ukraine peace plan. Are we closer than ever before, or is peace still a distant prospect? Finally, we continue the discussion on Venezuela. The U.S. has taken out more ships and begun seizing oil tankers. What does this escalation mean for the future of Venezuela and U.S. operations there?
So shortly after we recorded that last episode, we had made like a prediction on how long the shutdown would go, and it ended up ending like a day after. So we kind of missed that pretty bad. I think I was projecting, I don't know, by Thanksgiving or after, but then if it failed, it would go on the entire year. But long story short, you're back to work.
Yep.
How are things going?
Things are busy and a bit stressful because we just started on Friday the spring semester, which I know is weird timing because now we're on break, but that's how it works. We had our first class of industry studies, which I think I've mentioned before. I'm doing strategic materials with a focus on critical minerals. And so I've been very, very, very busy prepping for that class. And it's not just prepping material, the curriculum, which I'm quite busy doing, but the class also features a lot of guest speakers. We take a lot of visits around the area. We have 2 domestic couplets. One is going to be in Arizona and the other probably Virginia. We have a full week domestic travel, which will be Denver and Las Vegas with California thrown in there. And
I hear you got Vegas in there. Nice.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of time to party there. Then Chile and Argentina. So just arranging all that. I'm just constantly emailing people and trying to set up times and just figure all those things out. But it's a fascinating subject. I mean, I'm really excited to be working on it, and I'm learning a lot.
You picked up like the triforce of like hot, sexy topics within industrial studies. You started off in energy, which, I'll say is pretty sexy right now. And then probably maybe the second sexiest, the autonomous systems, of course, last year, and now critical minerals, which particularly in D.C. and the focus of the Trump administration, very, very hot area. So congrats on getting these mission assignments.
Yeah, pretty good. I was telling my students, though, too, like this is top of mind for the government. Every official seems to mention it in some capacity. Mm-hmm. The government is doing a lot on it. And then we all get this unique opportunity to study all aspects of the industry, starting from exploration to extraction, all the way to making of EV batteries, rare earth magnets, to understand the industry in a way that I think most people who talk about critical minerals have never been exposed to.
Yeah, no, I think that's really the power of a course like it. Like you lead, because it is, it's rare to be, you can talk about these things theoretically, you can understand conceptually what are the bottlenecks and what are all these issues, but actually talking to industry practitioners that deal with it day to day, and then physically seeing it, that's very important in my mind, coming from the oil and gas industry. You get a new appreciation just seeing the physical scale of the activities being done, and then the challenges of logistics and things like that. So I think that's great. The students are getting exposed to that.
Yeah, so I'm definitely excited about it. It's been really interesting what I've been working on so far. And as you said, getting to speak with industry, to see it in person, and of course, then also supplement that with different government agencies, because everyone seems to be part of this movement these days, as well as getting the perspective from academia, who's doing a lot of research on new techniques and advancing the field that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, good stuff. Yeah.
So, kind of proof that critical minerals was top of mind, it was even mentioned in the national security strategy. So, moving on to that, on December 5th, the U.S. came out with its new national security strategy. The thing that has captured most people's attention is that there's no mention of China as a strategic competitor or pacing challenge. And this is just extremely surprising because this certainly has motivated, at least since the first Trump administration, U.S. national security strategy.
Yeah, no, that definitely was very surprising. And I guess you'll get into kind of the reasons driving that. But is it really, because we had talked early on, I mean, is this really kind of proof that the Trump administration, like foreign policy apparatus, believes in like this great powers and that the world can be carved up into spheres of influence?
I'm not so sure. There's definitely different ways of looking at framing this document. And I'm not completely sure about the spheres of influence argument.
Mm.
So the other really notable aspect of this document is the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. In particular, he talks about reposturizing the military to this area. He doesn't mention China by name, but he talks about non-strategic allies, kicking them out of the region, privileging commercial ventures in the hemisphere, and just an overall U.S. focus on the area. I think in part of the military reposturing, I think there are some questions of exactly where do these troops come from? Are we de-emphasizing other regions? Is this coming from the Middle East and maybe Europe, which Trump has talked about, that no longer having a U.S. focus on? And the kind of problems that they list is drug trafficking and migration. And is the military truly the best tool to fight these sort of conflicts?
I mean, that was probably the most interesting, the framing of the problem. Because, yeah, they mentioned kind of the non-strategic competitors and evoke the Monroe Doctrine. But in reality, it seemed like the focus is more on kind of the domestic drivers of like immigration. You know, we're doing this to prevent the hordes from attempting to invade the United States and fundamentally change its culture. So you see like aspects of the culture war, you know, even within that policy, because it's not like an overt plan to how are we going to keep China out of our hemisphere? What are we going to do to reduce and induce commercial incentives that exist within South America to remove China, to remove access to ports that the Chinese have? It wasn't really focused on that. Like, to your point, they didn't even name China, you know, in that section of the document, really.
No, but it was heavily focused on the type of commercial opportunities, making the United States the first partner of choice when these countries are pursuing economic projects.
How do you do that, though?
Well, it doesn't say, nothing in the security strategy says how you accomplish these things. It just says what the goals are.
Yeah.
And it did talk about the U.S. ambassadors and other aspects of government promoting U.S. businesses in the region.
Do that when you've cut back diplomatic staff and ambassador.
The how is vague, but I think that's probably true in most national security strategies.
Yeah, I think that's the problem is I haven't really, normally it doesn't get so much attention because, you know, our policy's been pretty consistent. I mean, I think they even make that point in a lot of the responses to it is that this document differs so much from the first Trump administration, which is basically like a little bit of an America First spin on otherwise what's been a pretty consistent strategy since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think the focus on China as the strategic competitor really began under the first Trump administration. So I think in that way, you saw a bigger shift in the strategy under first Trump, but definitely not these more dramatic changes that are in some ways America first, but not as isolationist as I think some commentators have made it, particularly when we think about this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, maybe it reflects also like this split or this where they kind of agree within MAGA, because you definitely have a isolationist part. And maybe that's kind of what I was referring to around the immigration part. Like a guy like Stephen Miller would be on board with anything that would prevent kind of maybe the economic incentives for migrants trying to come to the United States. We're even overthrowing, although this doesn't make any sense, you know, trying to overthrow like Maduro. And then you have Rubio, much more traditionalist, internationalist, you know, in his foreign policy approach, who's, you know, has a passion project, particularly around ending the Cuban regime and sees Venezuela as the linchpin that's keeping Cuba propped up. So if you can end that economic lifeline to Cuba, you get rid of the two most, and in his eyes, the most despicable socialist regimes in the hemisphere.
What's interesting, though, is this doctrine critiques previous strategies that were about promoting democracy and human rights. And yet the reason why we'd want to get rid of the governments in Venezuela and Cuba are because they're not democracies.
Yeah, for ideological reasons.
Right.
And why Trump seems to target everybody that's on the leftist, and then also dislikes all of Europe if it's not part of the far right. But at the same time, they're he-men, pragmatists that aren't worried about ideology. And I think they're just in promotion of illiberalism.
Sure. If you're far right, then you can be as non-democratic as you want. But if you're socialist, that's a problem.
Right.
I see that. So there's a big emphasis on that in this document that is very notable. As you mentioned, migration, pretty much all the same stuff that they're always saying about immigration, U.S. secure borders. But I did think it was interesting because they talk about working with sovereign nations to end transnational migration, period. So they don't just want to increase security of our borders, but they want to end in general migration, which is such a strange goal and ignores why people migrate in the first place, right? From climate events, which many would say come from climate change, a natural disaster.
That's a hoax.
I know,
that's
right?
also stated within the document. So
it is stated in the document, but that's why people migrate, famine, economic harsh conditions, conflict. Right. I mean, he does say we need to have peace everywhere so people don't feel like they need to migrate from conflict. There's a lot of emphasis on Trump as a peacemaker. And that we should engage in peacemaking activities even where it does not directly affect U.S. interests, which I thought was an interesting comment because the rest of the document is we need to only focus on what affects U.S. national interests. But this is the one part of the document that says peace treaties and engaging in the peace process should happen even if it doesn't affect U.S. national interests.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the commentary around it has been that this went to, and this document does normally have multiple authors because it's like a multi-agency document, but normally it's smoothed out. Like somebody, I don't know, within the White House or Defense, or I don't know where the White House issues it, that somebody would like smooth out kind of these rough edges. But yeah, it's a pretty big contradiction there.
There's a lot of contradictions that I will get further into, but I do think what they're probably saying is as long as it's a peace process that Trump can, insert himself into and then call him like the greatest peacemaker, which this document does refer to him as. But if it involves military, that's where we don't want to get involved in places that don't meet our national interests.
They lean somewhat on the peace through strength, that by having just a strong, dominant military, a lot of things around dominance, best in the world, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. So it still embraces American preeminence, I guess, without the ambitions of global leadership or democratic promotion anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's peace because everybody else will fear us because we're such a mighty power. Mm-hmm. Who would dare start a war? And if they do, just the mere presence of our great leader, intervening should bring about peace because of our mighty strength.
Right. It talks a lot about military strength. It also talks about economic strength as well. So I totally concur with that. And that is supposed to create a system of peace throughout the world, essentially. And also just, Trump's superior negotiating skills.
Oh, yeah. Part of the deal, baby.
Yeah. So, from the perspective of where I teach, which is a focus on resources involved in conflict, the things that my colleagues would be happy about for sure is the language on reviving the defense industrial base, securing critical minerals and supply chains. One thing that I thought was interesting, though, was emphasis on one of the leverages that the U.S. has in getting countries to choose us as a partner first instead of China is sharing of defense technology. And I wonder if there's a context for that. That's something we're very reluctant to do, obviously. with most countries, even our allies. And I was just a little bit curious if they had any real strategy behind this.
I don't know beyond, the willingness to sell them some of the more advanced equipment or aircraft. Because I feel like didn't we make a deal to sell like the F-35s to Saudi Arabia or somebody, one of the Gulf states? And that came as kind of a surprise because that was outside of NATO, the first commercial kind of agreement on the sales of these. And that was kind of widely interpreted as, well, you're in our camp. Also, you're probably funneling a lot of personal deals to Trump and his associates. So as a gift, we'll give you, with these, you're not provide. It's more the internal electronics and the capabilities. You're not giving like necessarily the latest gen version of these platforms, but nevertheless, you're giving them access to platforms. So maybe it refers to that. I don't know. Maybe I'm being generous there.
Yeah, it was just a very curious thing that I haven't noticed people pick up on, but is repeated throughout the document.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emphasis on the U.S. being the partner of choice, which implies not choosing China for investment deals, economic deals, trade deals. I mean, it even mentions how much exports from China go to Africa and wanting to privilege trade relationships with the United States instead. So it's just kind of an interesting caveat that's thrown out there.
Okay. I guess I could see that. I don't know, all these nations can afford some of our defensive tech, if that's the idea. I'm like, okay, we're going to take away, business in Africa by offering these leaders, hey, you can buy F-35s, like first jet technology for your Air Force. So.
I agree. Like I said, I don't know how it'd work. I just thought that was an interesting aspect of it. But certainly study the problem of not having an industrial base in the United States, making it harder to compete if there were a conflict with China, certainly are good things.
Yeah, I agree.
Troubling, very troubling, is all the cultural language regarding an increasing multicultural Europe. So Europe is really talked in derisive terms in this document. And as sort of part of the culture war aspect of this document, it talks about Europe losing its Western civilization foundation as it grows more multicultural because of migration, as it allows the EU to essentially exist and make regulations, anything that is not putting each nation's sovereignty first. Essentially supporting the far-right parties. They call it patriotic parties. So these parties that will put national sovereignty over transnationalism like the EU. But again, the statement that in 20 years, if the trends continue, Europe will no longer look like what we think of as Europe, clearly referring to this very idea of a white, more homogeneous Europe.
Yeah, lots of disturbing elements. And this is definitely the thing that got the headlines, more than anything, was it seemed like the very little mentioning of Russia, very little mentioning of China. But no, apparently Western Europe is our almost like strategic adversary, or the one that requires like the greatest level of intervention, even though there's a lot of non-intervention and but in this case.
It's kind of conflictual because on one hand, Europe needs to provide more for its defense. So this is very clearly and not rely on the U.S. and feel more like they have power against Russia. I thought that was interesting that Europe is neglecting how much power they have vis-a-vis Russia. But we need to actively intervene to make sure that Europe doesn't lose its cultural heritage.
Yes, I think it was a real wake-up call to what's already been telegraphed by this administration. I think particularly like J.D. Vance's speech towards the beginning of the year at the Munich conference really sent shockwaves. The fact that, Ukraine, Russia, hardly mentioned at all, but internal matters, within the UK, within Germany, around perceived censorship of far right-wing parties was basically what he spent all of his time complaining about. You got another snippet into kind of what the top levels of the administration think of Europe with Signalgate and some of the text messages that were sent during that operation, just expressing an absolute disdain for Europe, perceiving its leaders as weak and feckless, And I think this document just reinforces and just establishes it as official Trump doctrine that these regimes ruled by these feckless, failed liberal politicians deserve disdain and furthermore deserve to be undermined for these quote unquote patriotic parties. So I definitely encourage everybody. I've mentioned this podcast before, but The Rest is Politics, which is led by a former Tory MP and a former kind of speechwriter and head of strategy for Tony Blair. They spent kind of a whole episode, just on this and basically framed it as this is it. You can't view the U.S. as an ally, definitely over these next 3 years. And that, European capitals need to wake up around this and view the U.S. as what it is, as a threat, now to these countries, to their values. And, in a way, maybe it'll accomplish what in terms of like reactivating national defense capabilities of these countries. They're certainly not off to a great start, as we'll talk about in the Ukraine section. But it definitely, it shocked, a lot of European leaders and outraged them. And I think rightfully so.
Yeah, it's pretty striking in a national security document to have this call for cultural interventionism. Again, as we've said, while the rest of the document says that we're not going to intervene ideologically and, we're upholding national sovereignty and however states want to run their countries. So the part on Europe is very disturbing and kind of dark and very different than the rest of the document.
Yeah, I think just reflecting a completely different authorship. I don't know if the vice president in his office like in that specifically, but it is, it just represents like this absolute disdain for Europe. I think one interesting part is it was leaked that a earlier version of this plan featured the out and out strategy to peel away certain target countries within the European Union in order for to encourage them to have a similar Brexit event. I think it was like Poland, Italy, Hungary, of course, and one other country that's slipping my mind. They weren't prepared to come out that overtly, but it did get leaked out.
Yeah, it does mention Eastern Europe and Southern Europe as trends in the EU that they would want to encourage.
Yeah, they see those as natural defenders of traditional values and of Christianity, and that those countries should be encouraged. And that's not even universal, like across those countries. Everything around this will have kind of the opposite effect, hopefully, domestically within Europe. When these institutions are under assault, when you see a foreign power essentially trying to intervene, within your domestic matters, there's a natural backlash and a rally against that. You see these not as quote unquote patriotic parties, but as traitors. These are people that are caving in to a foreign power.
Right. So what I would also vote as the most annoying comment in the whole document is a call for American traditional families to have healthy children, and that being important to national security.
So is that like a nod to the Maha movement? I mean, I didn't even know like Robert Kennedy Jr.'s like has the pen too.
Yeah.
It's like throws that in.
Healthy children.
Healthy. Was that defined in there?
It wasn't defined. No,
just healthy.
It was just like a sentence that is calling for American traditional families to have healthy children as the backbone of our national security.
Yeah.
I know there's not a lot to say.
It's not like you get object to it. I mean, we do have an obesity problem that has like flattened out and beginning to decline thanks to the GLP-1 drugs. But yeah, it's a loaded statement, particularly with this administration.
Obviously, it's a very culture war to say traditional families.
Oh, traditional. Oh, that was in there and then healthy. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's real loaded.
Yeah. So I just thought that was annoying. And then I wanted to go to the two things that you've alluded to before, both what is most debatable about it and what is contradictory about it. But starting with most debatable is this idea that the document is dividing the world into spheres of influence. And I think you can look at it in two ways, and I think commentators have. On one hand, it's really striking that it just outright says we are no longer pursuing being a superpower. We do not believe in the U.S. being a superpower.
Yeah, because I had a little issue with kind of how that was framed. I think it's also maybe comes down to the definition of superpower. How I saw this document being framed is that the United States should not attempt to be a unipower. So it shouldn't attempt to have primacy at a global scale or have global ambitions.
I suppose that's how I would define a superpower.
Yeah, but superpower, well, I guess I'm always like with the Cold War. America and the Soviet Union, obviously, the two main superpowers during the Cold War with like global influence, in its areas. But I've defined that as like different than the moment after the Cold War when there was really a single superpower and a unipower. This is what the French called at the beginning of the Iraq War a hyperpower. That's what I saw more the document as criticizing, is that we have to get rid of this unipolar moment. But it's not necessarily you're giving up superpower status because, a lot of the document is still about, one, you have the entire Western Hemisphere. That's kind of implies some sort of superpower.
Well, basically, the idea of a superpower is to influence events beyond your own region. So there are regional powers and there are superpowers in international relations. And
right, but it doesn't give up Asia. I mean, that's what's kind of weird about that.
The other part is debatable, right? I said on one hand, it's clear that we're not pursuing global dominance as a leader, right?
Right, which I interpret as some different than being a superpower, but yeah.
I'm just going with the definitions as it's been presented to me in international relations. On the other, you have making sure that no other country is a superpower either that attains global dominance.
Yeah, okay. Well, I must not be familiar then with the exact definition.
Again, you have regional powers. Yeah. So that would be...
Yeah, but I interpret that as something like barely beyond your own borders, as opposed to a whole hemisphere, which covers...
No, I wouldn't say that. No,
all right.
Not necessarily. So it's certainly in Asia, right, is not really just giving China control of the region, as you were kind of alluding to. It talks about deterring conflict on Taiwan and opposing a unilateral reunification, which is...
I mean, even mentioned AUKUS, and that's why this document's weird and was clearly written by 4 or 5 different people.
It talks about protecting the South China Sea and the freedom of navigation.
Right, yep.
And as you said just now, it has a strong Indo-Pacific alliance and asking for more defense spending from allies in that region.
Yeah, that was a consistent thing throughout all of the document. But
you're not...
Everybody needs to pay up. Yeah.
I guess my point is that you're not asking for more money on defense if you don't think that if you're going to just abandon all your interest in the area.
Yep. Yeah.
So he mentions the Quad specifically, and he mentions working with these partners.
Mentions India a lot, even though...
Which is weird.
Follow-through has been real bad on that.
Yeah.
On the tariffs.
So I think that this idea that critics have said that this just allows to divide the world into spheres of influence with China and Asia and Russia and Europe, I did not see it as being true.
For that, yeah. Well, I mean, if you just read like the Monroe Doctrine portion of it, it ignored the rest. I could see that.
Yeah.
In the disdain for Europe. I think you're reading a lot because it's not like Russia's even mentioned a lot at all throughout the whole document.
It's mentioned that the U.S. and Europe needs to have a strategic reset with Russia.
Right, yeah.
Which people have been critical of too.
Yeah.
But to some extent, saying that we need to have a relationship with Russia at some point, I mean, we can't just pretend Russia doesn't exist. So I guess it's true in some fashion.
Yeah. I mean, that would be part of any eventual peace deal with Ukraine would be normalization of relations with Russia.
So I think people have made too much about that. But I don't think it just gives Europe to Russia. It does mention Ukraine a little bit in the sense that Europe is not doing enough on its own, essentially, to secure conflicts like Ukraine. But it doesn't concern itself with Russia overly much.
Right. Yeah.
And it made that interesting comment, like I said before, on that Europe has to realize how much power it has over Russia, which to me speaks to we were talking about this in one of my classes, and the Norwegian student was just really frustrated at the administration not acknowledging that a resolution to the Ukraine conflict looks differently to Europeans than to the United States, and just how they feel the stakes are so high and the consequences of it. And to me, I read that statement as saying, look, you guys should not be worried about Russia's intervention, further invasion, because you guys have enough military power as it is to deter Russia.
Yeah, even as they seek to undermine the institutions to help concentrate that military power in an effective deterrence mechanism like NATO and the EU.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously very contradictory. But as I said, I feel like we talk enough about what our interests in Asia are. And it's not like we're giving anyone Africa either. I mean, there's not a lot in the African section, but we actually mention Africa, and that doesn't always happen. Basically, like I said, it talks about China using Africa as this major export market and how the U.S. needs to make more inroads into that and change the relationship from one of giving aid to one of trade and investment. It does talk about U.S. has assets to be able to invest in securing rare earth minerals and economic trade relationships. And of course, always this balance of trade. It was kind of not surprising, but I thought it was interesting that they did mention Africa, particularly because as we're going to the contradiction, other parts of the Trump administration do seem to almost be writing Africa off and getting rid of so many of the consulates there. And having trade relationships with countries means they would have to have economic stability and infrastructure. We've gotten rid of a lot of the mechanisms to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that stood out to me too. The one part where they kind of bring in China, they talk about how it invests a lot of its profits back into loans for these countries, and then talks about the combined investable assets, within the global South between the U.S. and its allies was, nearly 6 or 7 times, the amount that China currently has deployed within those regions. And it was, alluding to, we can come up with new institutions or re-strengthen kind of the World Bank and find ways of making us, the preferable partner through these institutions. So I thought that was interesting that in that case, it was still saw use for international institutions like the World Bank and things specifically around kind of challenging China on the economic front, within these countries.
Yeah, definitely. It mentions, I think it's International Finance Corporation, which I've just been studying because it's very involved in securing critical minerals, giving loans to expand countries. Like there's a major investment in Brazil, expand one of its rare earths mines. So to use that as an arm to attract investment, give money, but also hopefully attract further investment from other entities and making these projects look viable. But part of the contradiction is, how can we be the partner of first choice in economic matters while we're also bullying these countries with tariffs?
No, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the main thing that comes to mind. You just hear in this document, and I've heard from other officials, tariffs are leverage. We're getting the best economic deal for the United States. We need fair trade. All the stuff in this document that we've heard on trade. But at the same time, these countries are supposed to choose the U.S. primarily as their economic relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've already seen it, like in the India example, and the fact that there seems to be a détente between like Modi and Xi that was really, Modi rightfully, having had, these heavy level of tariffs kind of imposed on by the Trump administration, then responds by, to build leverage on their side and undermine kind of everything that supposedly our national strategy calls for around the Quad and around these other aspects of taking business away from China and encouraging India to be kind of this manufacturer of choice.
One small example is I had an Indonesian student who came up to me after class and was talking about, we've been trying to make a critical minerals deal with Indonesia, but tariffs have broken up the negotiation on that. And he said that when the former president of Indonesia came to the White House, he was just essentially treated like a beggar, right? Just given no respect whatsoever. So the new president of Indonesia made his first foreign trip to China, where they rolled out the red carpet. And it's sort of, if we want to secure resources, how are we going to do that when we treat these countries poorly and China is treating them, at least with perceived respect?
Right.
It kind of gives China an edge, right?
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of thought about how you would have to treat countries in order for them to say, yes, we want to work with the U.S. over China.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a big disconnect there. I don't think they've thought through it.
I mean, it's billed as a strategy document that talks about goals and means and ends. And yet, I think like most arguments, the means is kind of a mishmash of contradictions. And certainly our actions are not consistent with achieving some of those goals.
Yeah.
And one thing I thought was interesting too is that it mentioned in several places soft power.
It was funny. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like, well, how can we be America first and exert this tremendous soft power, right? Because we're getting rid of a lot of the institutions of soft power.
Yeah, I don't know how they exactly define soft power. I mean, Trump's a big fan of Hollywood and wants to put out, I mean, I don't know if you knew this, but he personally commissioned for Rush Hour 4 to come out because he's a big fan of Jackie Chan. And he's actually very pro CCP. It's kind of gross. So there's again, maybe, I don't know, there's a connection with our softness on China as well. So yeah, he wants more movies like that, more movies, of course, elevated, through the Kennedy Center and some of the honors that recently wrapped up, Sylvester Stallone, a lot of the content, I'd say, like on Paramount now, which is very oil related between kind of Landman and then, Yellowstone before that. So I think maybe they maybe see soft powers and as long as we're projecting nice traditional conservative values through our media exports, that maybe that's the soft power, not so much the government level.
How we
soft
usually
power.
talk about soft power.
Yeah, no, not that stuff. More the cultural products that we send out.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm just guessing. I have no idea, but
that makes sense what they had in their head for sure. It was also interesting that they talked about our allies need to build their own industrial base. Yet at the same time, we want manufacturing to be in the United States, not in our allies. So, another contradiction.
Yeah.
It's not all bad. And I think the critics have hyperventilated in certain parts, but some of it.
Europe was pretty bad.
Europe was awful. But I think there are still some good stuff. The industrial base, supply chains, critical minerals. I mean, those are all things that the Biden
thing. That's been recognized for a while.
Right?
Yeah.
But yes, Europe, that was very, very troubling. But then again, China, is very mixed in the sense that we make it very clear that our interests conflict with China in many places, economically and strategically in the South China Sea and areas like that. So it's not like we're letting China off the hook, but we don't specifically name them as this threat like we have in the past.
Yeah.
So it's just, I think, more confusing than anything else.
Yeah. No, I definitely question kind of the motivations behind that.
And like you said, a lot of the contradictory stuff is probably because there's so many different authors, all with different ideas of what our international agenda should be.
No, for sure.
Okay, so on to the Ukraine peace plan. Has there been actual progress with this or not?
Yeah, I would say yes, a tentative yes, but it does follow a very similar pace that we've seen in the past with the Trump administration and kind of proposals that come out. And I think the Economist summarized it pretty well in the observation that Trump puts out a plan. This normally takes a very pro-Russian sort of stance. Everybody panics, freaks out. Then there's a conversation. The European leaders kind of get together with Zelensky. They then talk to either Trump or somebody in the White House or Witkoff or whoever. And then it usually kind of gets toned down. And then the proposals floated in front of Russia. Russia maintains its maximalist demands, and then the cycle begins again. So I think that's what we're seeing with this latest iteration of the plan, which came out November 24th. The White House issued this 28-point peace plan and immediately got a huge amount of pushback. There was even theories, maybe conspiracies that came out that they'd gotten hold of a Russian document and translated it, and it seemed to be like the exact version of this 28-point plan.
If we're following into the same cycle, then what makes this closer to peace than previous?
Oh, it probably isn't.
Oh.
It probably isn't, is what
you indicated that it was.
I think European leaders emerged. So, again, you had all this panic, November 24th, but then leaders met, including with the U.S. contingent, on December 15th in Berlin. They painted out of these talks a much more optimistic view. And that was really driven by the fact that the biggest thing that came out of that discussion was the lack of security guarantees, that were part of that 28-point plan. So the Trump administration has now said, that they're willing to submit, any final agreement to the Senate for approval. It's not known kind of the extent of it, if it's like a treaty. A lot of people aren't interpreting this as something as strong as like, the defense treaty we have with Japan, for instance. But nevertheless, it's seen as like a positive sign that the Trump administration wants this formally ratified, as you have to do, like with any sort of agreement, treaty. It did reiterate, unsurprisingly, no U.S. troop commitment to a pre or a post-war period, but was open to potentially enforcing a no-fly zone and also still committing to access to U.S. intelligence for allies and for the Ukrainian military. And then this agreement, again, emerging out of this December 15th meeting, allows for a volunteer European force in support of the Ukrainian military, which is allowed up to 800,000, which is considerable. I thought a good point was made from an analyst at CSIS, comparing to kind of the Russian demands in 2022 prior to the war in terms of like what they wanted Ukraine to be in versus kind of what's being proposed with this. 2022, the military, Russia was demanding 200,000 active military. This is like 800,000. So considerably greater. This one, obviously, pathway to EU membership, which is being actively promoted on both sides. And then, the potential presence of a European force, which you can say, these aren't NATO because it's not NATO sanctioned, but these are still NATO soldiers from the UK, from France. These are probably the two biggest commitments. I could definitely see Poland being part of that contingent as well. The way that it's structured right now, a lot of people interpret this as a major strategic loss for Russia. In between kind of the expansion of NATO that you saw with like Sweden and Finland joining, and then to have a still very large pro-Western Ukrainian military together with NATO, but not NATO forces also embedded with it, supported by U.S. intelligence and Air Force. So I think that's the reason maybe there's the optimism, but what it goes back to is like, why the hell would Russia agree?
Yeah, exactly what I was about to say. Why do we think Russia?
That's kind of, again, it's the cycle again. There's the very pro-Russian thing, and then the backlash against that, and then the U.S. backs down from the very pro-Russian agreement. But you can see the default for the Trump administration is pro-Russia because they want to do the deals. They're focused on the economic, even though Russia's a third-rate economic power. Its economy is smaller than Italy, but it's very fixated, again, because of the ease of the deals, the level of corruption, the payoffs for elites within the administration, I'm sure are all extremely appealing for doing business. Same reason he loves doing business in the Middle East. I mean, for the people that are the main proponents of these deals, it's a great opportunity. From a national strategy perspective that we just talked through, not so smart.
Yeah. You know what I learned this week? So I was looking at the Ukraine U.S. critical minerals deal. And all those...
Yeah.
As
Classic.
people are finding critical minerals is on my brain, there'll probably be a lot of antidotes. But I was looking at the terms of that, and the critical minerals are all in Donbass region, which is what the Trump administration wants Ukraine to give up to Russia.
Yeah, so that's another area that emerged out of this December 15th meeting, that the U.S. backed off of that in exchange for kind of a free trade zone, so that it allows, because of the investment reasons, that the area is not occupied currently by Russia, which is a considerable part of the oblast, would instead be like this free economic zone. So still under Ukrainian territory, but kind of a more neutral zone, but open for investment. I think the other economic aspect, they're very fixated on the nuclear plant, which is understandable. It's what the largest nuclear plant, I think, in Europe. It's currently offline, but made up a considerable portion of the electrical demand for Ukraine. So the U.S. has proposed a split of the electricity generated, half going to the Russian side, half going to the Ukraine side. It's not clear like who would operate the plant, which is under current Russian occupation.
Okay.
Yeah. So obviously tons of areas of contention with Russia. Yeah, the big part is the Donbass. Russia sees that part of the territories it's annexed. It's always claimed that, mostly Russians live here and that it should belong naturally to Russia. They have been making very small gains, but it's still, similar to when we had the last update, are many years away from being able to take all the territory in these two remaining eastern oblasts. So that probably alone, and then the presence of European forces within it. That was something that Russia came out strongly against. I think that was also in that 28-point plan, was not allowing any sort of European forces in there. It's probably dead on arrival. But for some reason, there's still optimism. And I think that may be driven by, maybe some of the economic pressure that they feel like Russia will be under going forward because of oil prices. With oil prices having fallen to 60 on Brent, but Russian realized prices are now down at $35 a barrel. And that represents a significant cut, part of it being driven by some of the risk around the shadow fleet, which also is covered under when we talk about Venezuela. So that higher percentage differential, one, likely affects the current global market is really oversupplied with oil. And now there's a higher risk premium due not only to kind of what's going on with the U.S. with the shadow fleet, although it has not been targeting Russian vessels, but Ukraine has been physically attacking these vessels. So it certainly raises the risk premium for those investors that, I don't know who owns the vessels, who invested in it, but certainly the risk premium for that. So the Russians simply aren't getting as much for their crude. Before, I think that the discount was fairly small. And that was a lot of the negotiation with the G7 and some of the EU's actions in order to keep like a price cap, on Russian oil. But it's considerably below anything that they envision currently. So maybe the hope is that Russia will take this deal because it's seen as the best that they can get currently, and they're going to be under increasing financial pressure in a world where oil prices are so low. And Ukraine's having success, not so much in the attacks on the shadow fleet of vessels itself, but also on the refineries, which is probably a much greater economic impact on Russia.
I'm skeptical.
I think it's a little overstated myself too. I think Venezuela is kind of a perfect example of it, is that regimes can survive under, especially authoritarian regimes, can survive under extraordinary economic pressures. Far worse. I mean, because Venezuela is far worse than anything envisioned for Russia. But what this will do is, maybe the articles framed it as, maybe this will tip Russia into a recession. They're at 8% inflation. These are hardly numbers. I mean, they seem bad from a democracy or from a developed economy point of view, but for Russia, I don't think they break any sweat. The key for Russia is that they're still able to recruit, a huge amount of manpower, that the war machine via China is still powered up. Yeah, they're going to lose some revenue, obviously, but it doesn't seem to result in like some sort of financial crisis that would actually hurt the war machine.
That's why I was skeptical.
Yeah, I think it's just a different yardstick, and I don't know if it's something that Western analysts or the media kind of look at these numbers and say, oh, well, this would lead to the fall of whatever government, within Europe or government in the U.S. would put such political pressure on these regimes. But these numbers are nothing, especially historically.
Yeah.
And especially historically for
inflation,
Russia.
I mean,
I'm like, oh no,
Argentina was
it was hundreds of percents of yeah.
Yeah. And that's in a democracy. So I agree. I think there's always this perception that you can squeeze countries economically and result in some sort of regime turnover. And I can't think of any historical examples of where that happened. I'm not saying that there aren't any, but if there are, they're pretty rare.
Yeah. And of course, this isn't as severe as wanting regime change, but is it enough that Russia abandons its maximalist goals? And from what we see,
one could say that will only happen if there's regime change.
If he feels limited in the ability to wage war, take the win. You can always frame it as a win. You gain nearly 20% of Ukrainian territory. You've caused the West to back down. There's ways that you can frame it as a strategic victory for Putin. As we've talked about, I mean, what off-ramp, it never made sense why he's still, I mean, it makes sense why he's still, because he interprets weakness and opportunities, particularly within the Trump administration, on still pursuing maximalist aims.
Yeah, I don't think that what about this has discouraged Putin from having those maximalist ideas. I mean, if that's what he's really going for, I mean, he could have always just focused on these separatist areas that they've annexed and claimed. They may not be winning, but they're not losing.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting quote from The Economist that Putin made to Indian journalists, saying that he would liberate Donbass and Russia by military or other means. And what's notable here is that the territory the Russian Empire once termed Russia stretches past Odessa, which again is outside of these four provinces, into Moldova.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that he's not just fixated on those four provinces they annexed. He wants that entire region kind of around the Black Sea.
I think it'll have to be quite a bit to change Putin's perspective, his whole mindset. And I don't think that anything has revealed enough pressure in order to do that. And I can't imagine any deal Russia approving of that's not heavily favoring Russia, which would not be acceptable to Ukraine or the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be enough that, you would feel confident that you've crippled Ukraine, that you can go in 5 years later and take Odessa and then march on to Moldova. So it probably is dead on arrival, short of, again, like what you said, a signal being sent, either prolonged economic uncertainty, a real targeting of the shadow fleet, which I think, as we'll talk about, this is actually an opportunity within oil markets to actually do that and not really suffer the economic consequences.
Prices are so low.
Yeah.
But Trump wants them lower.
Doing that. Yeah, he wants it. He wants it at 50, for the U.S. It's basically that. The domestic price is pretty close to 50. So he's succeeded. This is his one area that he's wildly successful. He's delivered on his promises on inflation around gasoline. Nothing else, but Americans are better off for gasoline.
Well, I mean, that's something. I don't think he will want to significantly reduce the amount of oil on the market because that would make oil go up.
Unless you really want to get a deal done and be the peacemaker. This is an area of strong leverage. If you went after the shadow fleet, maybe you cause enough pain where the off-ramp looks attractive as opposed to the maximalist gains. I don't know. Something has to change to get Putin to that off-ramp you want him on.
I just think the psychology of Putin, how he's revealed himself in this war. I mean, a lot of things he's done certainly didn't make sense to us, right? Like attack Kiev and try to go for the whole country in the beginning. And yet they reveal how committed he is to this sort of maximalist aim, whether the practical reality supports it or not. So I think it'll take pretty extreme circumstances for him to say, oh, the reality is we should take a deal.
Yeah, and that was the whole idea of the escalate to de-escalate.
But
Ukrainians on their own, on zero budget, are striking target. The one tanker that they struck was in Libya. Obviously, they had the extremely bold operation on the other side of Russia earlier in the year with the drones. And they're attacking these refineries now pretty consistently, but they don't have the full capacity to use, like U.S. or European armaments to strike Moscow leadership at will.
Yeah, exactly. So I just don't see enough to change Putin's mindset.
Yeah, which is probably why this is doomed to failure. I think the other thing that I alluded to earlier that I wanted to mention quickly was EU continuing to signal weakness. So the EU had a long drawn out debate. It looked like early in this week that they were going to use, which was a controversial but a bold move, to take the Russian assets that are currently frozen in European banks to a tune of $246 billion and use those assets as leverage to fund loans to Ukraine over the next 2 years. That, however, fell apart. Now, they did put together a deal for $105 billion worth of loans to help fund Ukraine over the 2 years. But you saw Europe kind of fall apart around the use of these frozen assets for two different reasons. One, Belgium came in and felt like they were going to be on the hook, which is always kind of a funny thing because there's still there's a legal framework and Russia would be able to challenge maybe in a post-war environment and be able to sue for the seizure of these assets. And Belgium was worried it personally, as a country, would be responsible because it's located in Brussels. So it asked naturally for support from the bigger countries within Europe, but France, Italy, and Luxembourg, which I guess just because they're rich and they don't want to, had objections to granting Belgium any of these assurances. So the whole thing basically fell apart. So it really just kind of, again, signaled Europe with the, being made of all these different nation states, can't get its act together, is too fractious, and can't send this strong message to Russia that, we're taking your money and we're paying Ukraine with it and you can suck it. I don't know.
Yeah, international law is kind of fascinating. And I remember reading a paper that was talking about Ukrainian companies suing Russian companies for essentially taking over assets when the annexation of Crimea and winning, but also Russia winning some cases too on that front. So, I think, Belgium has had good cause.
Reasons to be worried. Yeah. Yeah.
Because they do. The problem for the EU in Trump's eyes is they respect international law.
Yeah, for sure. Where international law exists, that it's not just the supremacy of the nation state.
Yeah.
Above all. Yeah.
Although, you can sue international law in the United States as well. We haven't completely abandoned it. It would be interesting to see cases of survivors of these Venezuela strikes. I think there's at least one.
For Hexa.
There's at least one case that I know of that's suing in the U.S. for damages or something regarding the strike on their boat, saying that they were not carrying any illegal illicit.
Oh, okay. And they sue, I guess he can pursue it from multiple, I don't know. I guess you have indemnity as a government worker. You're suing the U.S. government, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You couldn't pursue Hegseth, let's say, after he left office and after the end of the Trump administration.
No, I think you're just suing the government.
Okay. All right. So his personal assets aren't
no
under fact.
You certainly saw lawsuits. I don't know how they were ever determined, but lawsuits for drone strikes in Afghanistan and other areas.
Oh, really? Wow.
There's a really interesting story on some podcast that was how much is a human life, because we would pay money to these families,
settle out of court sort of thing,
for these the innocents who were killed in these strikes.
Oh, yeah. How much was it worth?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
I wish I remembered. It was a really interesting word. I wish I remember what podcast it was on, but it's a pretty comprehensive update on Ukraine. And now to our next and final update, which is on Venezuela and the beginning signs of what it means to have a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, so it's been a very active couple of weeks as the U.S. seems to continue to escalate around a potential war with Venezuela. I think the most provocative actions that have happened have been around the oil tankers in the shadow fleet that Venezuela depends on in order to get around U.S. sanctions of its oil exports. So the U.S. seized an oil tanker that was bound for Asia on December 10th. And then a week later, it announced a blockade of all targeted tankers. Now, the seized tanker was carrying about $80 million worth of crude, and Trump basically said that belongs to us now. So I'm not sure if they just took it to a port in Houston and offloaded it and cashed it for the U.S. Treasury. I don't know how that works. But in terms of the tankers, there are like 30 tankers in the Caribbean that have been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department. And this obviously represents an existential threat to Venezuela because oil exports make up more than half of the country's total fiscal revenue. So last Tuesday, Trump announced on Truth Social that Venezuela had stolen the, quote, oil, land, and assets from the U.S. to finance criminal activities. So this was seen as like another, we've heard about Maduro is the head of this cartel. Mm-hmm. They've been pushing fentanyl into this country. Cartels have been designated as terrorist organizations. So as the head of this terrorist organization, we have the right to go after Maduro and anybody associated with his regime. But the second one is basically like damages. Like you have seized the oil, land, and assets from the U.S. I thought it was like worth digging into the historical background, and the Washington Post provided a nice summary of it. But Trump seems to be referring to the 1976 nationalization of oil and gas assets within Venezuela, and then the subsequent, under Chavez, the 2007 seizure of the last kind of privately run, mostly like natural gas focused companies within the country. Needless to say, U.S. companies never owned the oil and the land. That's never been kind of part, even during like the colonialist period of days, is rather leased it under various Venezuelan governments. The oil industry has been active since the early 1900s within the country. And it's really just about the terms of those leases and the production sharing of the profits from those operations. Obviously, they strongly favored the private firms, during these periods in the early 1900s before seeing a more assertive government emerge. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just Venezuela where this happened.
But didn't this happen in most of the Middle Eastern countries as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, those were Western assets that they then nationalized.
Yeah. Basically, American companies operated most of the oil and gas fields within Saudi Arabia at the time. BP famously began in Iran and around kind of the establishment of the oil fields there. So during this period in the 60s and 70s, resource nationalism was just kind of part of, and, is fully recognized by international law as, and was seen as almost like a post-colonial writing of justice. Naturally, the majority of the revenue coming from national assets should belong to that nation and not to private firms, represented from these other countries. So out of this 1976 and 2007, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Shell were impacted. They ended up with a loss of about $2 billion and uncompensated for the assets. There were also these additional natural gas assets. But to your point, the companies actually were able to challenge this and through international court systems. Two of them that were mentioned, one of them I wasn't familiar with at all, the International Chamber of Commerce. Okay. And then you have the World Bank's International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Now, between all of these lawsuits, rulings of $10 billion in damages have been awarded to the companies impacted, so primarily Exxon, Chevron, and Shell, but haven't been paid in full by Venezuela. But Venezuela's paying this. Yeah, so it was a little crazy. Kind of the takes that I read were Yeah, Venezuela, there was this lawsuit. Venezuela lost. Venezuela's like paying the damages. But now you're saying they just stole everything,
Yeah, that just
of
makes
which
sense.
that
But
makes a
it's
lot of sense.
interesting they're paying it because Venezuela
May
owes a
not be
lot
paying a
of
lot.
countries, a lot of people money, and they're not paying it because they don't have the money.
Right. And they really don't have the money now.
Yeah. But I mean, there's been currency problems, not even having currency to pay. So anyway, that's pretty interesting that they've been able to continue to pay on these.
Yeah. So I think the only thing that people can think is around these losses, from the nationalization process from 1976 and 2007. There's some sum of 10 billion or less. I don't know how much they paid on it. That Trump's to be like the mob boss. It's like, your time to pay is up. We're taking these assets, I guess, in lieu of because you're a deadbeat. I don't know.
I mean, they're just trying to find justification. And plus, the actual facts don't really matter so much to Trump.
Yeah. So I think that the thing I want to discuss is to see, what do you think the chances of war heading into the next year between U.S. and Venezuela? And I wanted to note, Polymarket has become a more and more influential in terms of like within the media and reporting on kind of these discrete political events. So the Polymarket, of which, I was looking at, I think tens of millions of dollars have been bet on it. So it's currently 8% by the end of the year that there's a conflict, but up to 51% by March that there's some sort of conflict. And then the other area people are currently gambling on is Maduro being out of power. So 38% odds for March of 2026, and then 56% by the end of 2026. So what do you think about those numbers?
Well, I can comment on them. I think you should never trust any one person if their projection percentage-wise. Sure, I definitely agree 8% by the end of the year. We're pretty close to the end of the year.
Yeah. So you're not taking that one. Could be big upside.
I still think Trump will try to avoid direct conflict.
So not even like a targeted airstrike on quote unquote drug sites or leadership?
Yeah, I say no at all.
Okay. So you're kind of in that. I mean, it's at 49%. Basically, people don't know. That's always, it's like 50% people are like, I don't know, maybe.
I wouldn't say that you should trust my prediction, but that's my prediction.
Yeah. It definitely runs counter to a significant part of the MAGA base for sure. Like I would say the vast majority don't want any involvement in a conflict like this. This does seem to be driven by Rubio and what we talked about earlier, to a lesser extent, maybe Stephen Miller on just, of course, that doesn't make a lot of sense. This is going to cause a much larger refugee crisis, having chaos and a war. But at the same time, you have this Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. You have a huge amount of force. You've seen the willingness to use the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard to blockade and seize vessels. So it seems like it's building up to something. And if Maduro's not willing to capitulate, doesn't that push Trump's hand at a certain point or otherwise look weak?
I think he gets to look tough just by
bombing fishing boats? Or by, I don't think he looks that tough.
He looks tough in his own mind. I just don't see direct attack on land.
So no airstrikes on land.
Right.
Okay. I disagree. I think there will be airstrikes.
It's hard for me to take a really strong position on this.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's a speculative thing, but it's just, I guess you're looking directionally between this new doctrine, between the inordinate buildup, like the largest naval buildup since the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of that seems to add up to something's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I totally see that perspective. I just have a hard time seeing Trump execute it.
Yeah, I think if he perceives it as low risk, if it's framed as like a low risk, no troops on the ground, or just special forces on the ground, like a quick strike, if it's framed as like the Iran thing, which they view not without justification, although, maybe not long-term justification, very successful, mostly because of the success of the IDF. But
it was very limited aim, right, though?
Yeah, and this I think would be limited aim.
To what?
I don't know, to decapitate Maduro. I think if they got a shot, they would take it. And maybe it would be masked as other strikes that they have in mind where they think they can say like drug operations were occurring on land. But they would take the opportunity to try to decapitate some part of the regime.
I accept the logic of your argument, but I think there's also a strong case to be made that Trump doesn't want to get involved in a conflict like this.
I mean, there's no cost. Well, I guess, I mean, you do look weak if you fail, right?
Or you get embroiled in it. I mean, if it's something that can't be taken care of in like 5 days or something like that.
Yeah, but I don't see them, as long as there aren't a large number of American troops on the ground, I don't think there's a big cost to it. And because I think the other thing is, one, because Venezuela exports has such a low impact on the oil markets, but then two, because the oil markets are oversupplied, you don't even have the economic geopolitical risk premium like on oil price. So
it's possible.
I don't know if you saw, I mean, Tucker Carlson came out. He was convinced that Trump, in this little speech, which I didn't watch, but you didn't watch it, but you heard about the next day.
Busy, and then,
that he was going to announce they were going to war with Venezuela. So Tucker Carlson was like convinced on that. I'm assuming that it's pretty close within the administration that they're actively preparing for it.
Well, that's a point in favor of your argument, for sure.
Well, I don't know if Tucker has the insights.
But that's
kind of on that.
I'm like, that's a point. I don't see, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that Tucker does have that much connection internally, but I don't follow it close enough. I just saw a headline that he made some people angry about something in MAGA.
Oh, yeah. Well, MAGA's currently in their little civil war over the Nick Fuentes interview. Is
that what it was?
Yeah, that's that. Yeah.
So 50-50, it could happen, but I'm going to stick to saying that Trump doesn't want to do it.
Okay. Man, we should place a bet. We could each place a little bet on Polymarket. Be degenerates ourselves.
I don't feel confident enough in my assessment to put a bet on it.
To put a $20 bet on?
Well, I mean, I guess. But we'd be neutralized.
Yeah, that's true. It would be no risk. Just bragging rights. But we put actual money to it, so we had like some stakes. But not really.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email, so Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in the episode.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.